In 1914, Europe's great empires were locked in a web of alliances, each confident that their massive armies could secure a swift victory. They marched to the front in colorful uniforms and plumed hats, but collided with high explosive shells and a volume of fire their generals never witnessed. The spark came from an assassination in Sarajevo. A complex web of alliances immediately pulled the continent's massive armies into a rapidly expanding conflict. In the early clashes, generals directed their men using outdated playbooks. They deployed troops for open-field maneuvers and ordered cavalry to charge, fighting exactly as they had in the previous century. They marched directly into the teeth of industrial manufacturing. Mechanized belt-fed machine guns and rapid-fire artillery cut down the exposed infantry by the tens of thousands in a matter of days. With no natural cover and a rain of flying steel making the surface lethal, survival required a radical shift. Armies were forced to abandon the open fields and desperately dig down into the earth just to stay alive. This map shows the race to the sea. Both sides tried to outflank one another, leapfrogging north until they ran out of land. What remained was a continuous 400-mile gash from the Belgian coast to the Swiss Alps. Soldiers carved fortified subterranean networks into the mud, bordered by miles of barbed wire and shattered leafless forests. The era of glorious cavalry maneuvers was completely dead. The conflict had mutated into a siege of attrition, where victory meant sitting in a ditch and bleeding the enemy out faster than they could bleed you. This schematic breaks down the defensive lines. A staggered front line sits behind thick barbed wire, facing the lethal no-man's land. Down in the mud, stagnant water bred disease. Soldiers lost entire feet to necrosis from standing in freezing puddles. To dislodge these entrenched defenders, armies relied heavily on long-range industrial artillery. They fired millions of shells from miles away, turning the landscape into a lunar wasteland, though they rarely breached the lines. Desperation bred terrifying science. Generals authorized the release of toxic chlorine and mustard gases, hoping to sink heavy, suffocating clouds down into the dugouts where artillery couldn't reach. The primary countermeasure was swift but grim. Canvas and rubber gas masks saved lives, but they severely restricted vision and breathing, forcing men to fight blind and gasping in the chemical fog. None of these innovations broke the deadlock. The artillery barrages and poison clouds didn't move the map. They simply industrialized the slaughter, driving the daily casualty rates into the tens of thousands. Engineers introduced the armored tank, a lumbering mechanical beast built to crush barbed wire, absorb machine gun fire, and crawl directly across the craters of no man's land. The killing also expanded upward, the sky filled with fragile biplanes, evolving rapidly from unarmed scouting platforms into synchronized fighters and strategic bombers. At sea, the conflict slipped beneath the waves. German U-boats patrolled the Atlantic Ocean, deploying a tactic known as unrestricted submarine warfare. They actively hunted and sank merchant vessels and civilian passenger liners, deliberately trying to sever global supply lines and physically starve enemy economies into submission. The insatiable demand for fresh bodies soon pulled global empires entirely into the fray. Indian, Australian, New Zealand, and African troops were shipped across oceans to fight and die in trenches thousands of miles from home. Failing to win a quick victory in France, the warring states expanded the conflict into every possible domain. They weaponized the oceans, armed the skies, and fed millions of young men from across the globe into a continuous meat grinder. By 1917, the strain was unbearable. Frontline units mutinied and refused orders to attack, while civilian populations back home rioted over basic food rations. The pressure completely fractured the Russian Empire. A fierce revolution toppled the Tsar, collapsing the government and pulling Russia entirely out of the conflict. But as one massive power collapsed, another stepped in. Outraged by the continued submarine attacks on Atlantic shipping, the United States declared war, injecting millions of fresh troops and vast industrial resources into the exhausted Allied lines. Germany launched one final, desperate push, the Spring Offensive, trying to win before the Americans arrived in force. When that momentum broke, the Allied forces surged forward in the 100 Days Offensive, finally tearing the German lines apart. By 1918, the Central Powers had reached their limits. They were ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer industrial capacity and the fresh millions of troops provided by the Allied coalition. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. An armistice halted the fighting, washing an exhausted wave of relief over the surviving populations. This map illustrates the geopolitical wreckage left behind. 4 centuries-old titans, the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires, were wiped from existence, fracturing into dozens of new, smaller nation-states. The victorious powers then drafted the Treaty of Versailles. It dictated 50 billion gold marks in actual reparations and strict military disarmament, placing the financial burden squarely on a humiliated Germany. The human ledger was staggering. Up to 22 million soldiers and civilians were dead, and millions more were permanently maimed, a trauma compounded by the deadly global outbreak of the Spanish flu. The settlement left Germany economically ruined and politically humiliated, fostering an active resentment that many leaders publicly refused to accept. This unresolved bitterness meant the conflict ended without addressing the very